Hi guys, I'm Adam Thomas. I'm a tattoo artist from the UK, and today we're going to talk about doing stencils on the iPad using ProCreate. So the first tip that I'd say is always lock your stencil layer. So when you're doing a design and a stencil for your client, you're going to have a lot of layers knocking around, some for your design, and then you're going to have one there on the top, presumably for the stencil. What I've done in the past is when I've been going through and clicking different layers, I'll accidentally click onto the wrong one. So I'll be thinking that I'm on my stencil layer, but I'm actually on my design layer. So the problem you're going to have with that is if you start then doing lines, everything's going to look fine on the screen. But once you start checking your stencil, you'll realize that you've done it all over the design. So in essence, you've just drawn a load of lines all over the design that you've put together for the client. So the problem with that is you can't then use those lines for the stencil. Plus you've just drawn a load of lines all over the design that hopefully if you can undo, you'll be able to take them off. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to be in a world of pain. So what I do to make sure that I don't do this is once I've finished the design and I've started that new layer, I make a habit of going back over the design, swiping on the layer name in the little drop down, and that'll bring up some options. If you click lock, that'll lock the master layer and it'll stop you from being able to access that unless you unlock it. So what that means is you can't accidentally then draw lines all over your design. It's going to save you loads of time, loads of effort, and loads of headaches if you've done half your stencil on the wrong layer. The amount of times I've been screaming at my iPad because I've drawn half an hour's worth of stencil on the wrong layer that I now can't use. That is the biggest and best tip you're ever going to get using the iPad. So the second tip that I want to tell you about is using the right brush for the job. Over the last sort of couple of years I've been using ProCreate. I've used a lot of different brushes to do my stencil. Some of them have been really good, some of them not so good, some of them have been too thick, so by the time you put it through your thermal copier, the lines are just merging together. Some of them have been too fine and they look amazing when they're printed out, a super accurate stencil, but the lines are just too thin for the thermal copy to print up, and then you're just not going to get a really good stencil, if a stencil at all. The brush that I use on a day-to-day basis, if you go onto the brushes, go down to inking and then fine tip, I find that brush, its size and the way it works putting lines down on paper are super consistent and makes for a really good stencil, and I've never had any problems putting it through the thermal copier. Now I always set my ProCreate to A4, which gives me a really good indication of how big it's going to be before I even start trying to size it up against my client. But I also find that on the A4, that line size is perfect for the thermal copier. And like I say, I've had no problems with trying to get a line to come out super solid and consistent once I put it through the copier. The only thing that I do adjust, mainly just to make my stencil slightly better, I suppose, is the streamlining. So if you click on the brush, you can change the streamlining settings. What that's basically going to do is just iron out any creases. So if you've got it on maximum on 100%, it's going to iron out some of those creases. So any little movements, any shakes and jitters in your hand when you're doing lines on the iPad, it's just going to take those out and smooth them out. If you turn it down to 0, it's going to pick up every tiny little movement. Now sometimes that's amazing. If you've got a little bits where you do want to get those little textures and those lumps and bumps, yeah, you want to turn it right the way off. But if you've got something that you want to get really nice and smooth, especially any sort of like neo-trad work or things that have got a lot of really smooth, solid lines in there, yeah, you want to ramp that streamlining up, and it's just going to make your life so much easier, give you a much better stencil, and in turn going to make a much better tattoo. So tip number 3, do all the boring parts first, because no one really likes doing stencils. It's the tattooing that everyone really enjoys doing. While you've got that high level of motivation at the start of the day, spend a bit of time just doing all the boring parts. So the biggest, most boring part of a stencil that I hate doing is hair. So if I'm doing a portrait and I've got some big flowing hair, it's an absolute nightmare. It's really hard, one, to pick out lines that you want to use. So for me, I always get the hair done out of the way first. So while I've got the energy to get it all done and to get it done as accurately and as best as I can get it done, that way once you do start slacking off a little bit, all you've got left to do is the fun stuff. So eyes, nose, mouth, face, all you're after is trying to get the best stencil you can do. Now I used to do this when I used to do hand stencils. I still do it now when I do ProCreate stencils. So it's probably less of a ProCreate tip and more of just a stencil tip in general. So tip number 4, pretty similar to the last one in the sense of it's a general stencil tip, but it's something that I do on ProCreate every single day when I do stencils, is using solid lines and dash lines. So when I first started doing stencils, when I first started tattooing, I'd have lines everywhere. I'd have a massively complicated stencil that was super hard to read. What you're going to find is it's going to suck up so much time during the tattoo process that you're going to spend trying to translate your own stencil once you're tattooing it. If you've got lines everywhere, you're not going to know which line is for somewhere solid or which line is for like shading reference for the value and tones. And so what I find is the easiest thing to do, and like I say, I've been doing it for years since I've been tattooing, is using solid lines and dash lines. So your solid lines for me means somewhere that I'll either be grey lining or it's going to have a solid edge to it, where like either black meets white, or like I say, there's going to be a solid line there. My dotted lines, they generally just mean that that's where my shading is. So if I've got a big shadow being cast, that'd all be a dotted line, which will just show me that that's where the shadow's cast. So I don't want a solid edge to it, I want it to be feathered out. It's going to save you loads of time, it's going to make your stencils still have that high level of information in there, but it's just not going to be as complicated as if everything was a solid line. So the fifth tip is your lines don't need to be black. So when you print them out, you don't need to have it on 100%, and it doesn't need to be completely solid black. So if you've got a load of solid black lines and you're putting those through the thermal copier, it's going to ramp up the heat and it's just going to make those lines super solid. And that might sound like an amazing thing, but if you've got a lot of lines that are really close together, what you're going to find is just going to blur them together. So by the time you stick that stencil onto the skin, the stencil solution and the carbon, it's just going to bleed and you're just going to be left with a big purple blob on the skin, and all that time and effort you spent making a nice stencil is just going to be completely wasted. So what I do, just turn the opacity down a little bit. It's going to slightly grow out those lines once they come out of the printer. So in turn, once you put that through the thermal copier, it's going to go through and it's just not going to be putting as much heat through, and it's not going to be as solid. But what that means is that those lines aren't going to be so thick and so heavy full of carbon, and they're not going to blur together. So when you put that onto the skin, it might be slightly more lighter than what you used to, but what you're going to find is those lines aren't going to blur together. You're not going to get a big purple mess. You're going to be able to see exactly where those lines are. So all that time and effort you put into doing the stencil in the first place is going to be transferred onto the skin, and it's going to make your life so much easier when you get into the tattooing process. Well, there we have it. That's 5 massive tips that I use on a day-to-day basis. There's loads of other stuff that I do, loads of stuff that I'm going to be talking about in a load of other videos. But in the meantime, if there's anything else you specifically want to know about ProCreate, leave them in the comments and I'll try and answer as many as I can on the next videos. Like I say, I use ProCreate for a lot of other things other than just doing my stencils. I do all my designing on here and a lot of artwork. So yeah, blast over some questions and I'll see if I can answer them, and hopefully, yeah, it'll help you guys out. If you like the video, drop me a like, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to have loads more tips and tutorials about everything I do on the iPad, plus things that I do tattooing wise. So yeah, cheers for watching, see you on the next video.